Welcome to the Farmhouse. I'm Stephanie Spiker.
And I'm Candace Worsbowski.
And recently I got the chance to talk to Cathryn Pugh, who is a forestry educator with Penn State Extension. Cat specializes in agroforestry, non-timber forest products, and native plants. And she also serves as the president of the Pennsylvania Native Plant Society. I actually first got to meet Cat up at Ag Progress Days when I covered a talk she was doing entitled 5 Native Trees to Add to Your Landscape. I enjoyed her personality and expertise so much during that talk that I just knew that I wanted to have her join me here on the podcast. Plus, honestly, I love talking about native plants. So, Candace, I know you're a bit of a plant and garden person.
Yes.
Do you think you know a lot about native plants? Like, for instance, if you walked into a garden center and you wanted to buy some natives for your yard, would you know what's native without having to Google it?
No, I wouldn't.
Honestly, same.
Yeah, and it's a shame. I feel like I'm always evolving, always learning in my gardening. The next big project is really, I say this every year, we're trying to get more pollinators, but We've got a new garden bed that we're prepping this fall to plant in for the spring. And this is going to be like our big pollinator bed. It would be great if those plants were native.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like planting for pollinators in a lot of ways inherently leads you to native planting, because to attract pollinators that are native, like the plants that they want the most are already native. So I feel like it's kind of like knocking out two things with one.
But honestly, like even sitting here, I don't know if I could really name too many plants that I know 100% sure are natives.
Yeah, it's something that I'm also trying to learn more about. And as you will all hear, Kat has some really cool resources that she will mention in case any of you listening also want to learn more about natives. So let's bring Kat into the farmhouse so we can all learn more about how to find some native plants and other fun tidbits about all things trees and plants. Kat, welcome to the farmhouse. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So here at the farmhouse, we are primarily focused on agriculture, but we have talked to a lot of people and that can encompass a lot of different things. So how can forestry and native plants factor into the ag industry?
Yeah, well, we can think about how native plants are also products in some cases. So there are a lot of different industries that already exist that use native plants. And so we can think about intertwining them with some already existing agricultural practices to diversify income.
Yeah. So I would love to dive a little into agroforestry specifically. If a farmer is really interested in maybe branching into that, what are some first steps and what are maybe some long-term goals?
So the first thing that I would recommend is thinking about what does your land look like? And what kind of practices are you already doing that work well for your lifestyle? And agroforestry can fit in a lot of different places and sometimes don't need to be just one practice. It can be a few different practices that work well. So there are 5 practices under this kind of umbrella term of agroforestry, which is essentially thinking about how to incorporate trees in agricultural systems. So it's trees plus crops or livestock. And those practices most of the time start with an agricultural site and add trees. So you might start with silvopasture where you have livestock already and you're adding trees to those systems. And in those cases, you're adding trees as a benefit for additional food sources. For, say, cows, if you grow something like honey locust and on a dairy system, that honey locust is high in sugar and can help with milk production. It also creates shade to lower stress of animals. You can grow lots of different types of livestock, including poultry too. So turkeys are common in silvopasture. That's one of the practices. So if you already have something where you're growing animals or like to have animals on site, silvopasture is a great option. Another is alley cropping. So this is if you're interested in kind of transitioning your landscape from, say, traditional farming to maybe a forest land, this is a good in-between practice. So you're growing rows of trees, and in between you have an annual crop. That's the alley in alley cropping. And in this system, you're getting an annual income from the crops in between in the alleyway, and then you're getting mid and long-term products from the trees. So sometimes those trees will take a few years, maybe up to 10 years or so, to produce some kind of harvestable product, whether it's a fruit or a nut. And then oftentimes you have to thin those trees. And in that case, you can use the trees that were thinned for things like fence posts or other kind of wood products. And then long term is those remaining trees can then be used for timber at some point. So that's called alley cropping. So if you already have some kind of system that's growing annual crops and you're interested in transitioning to a forest, say you're aging out of farming, you want to move into retirement, but you still want some kind of income, that's a great option. You can also combine this with silvopasture in some spaces. So it could be an alley crop, but in the alley, it could be forage for livestock. A third one would be windbreaks. So we're using it for breaking the wind, but we're also getting something out of it to harvest. So this is usually an evergreen mixed with deciduous trees so that you get windbreaks all year, slow down snowdrift. And so that could be used all across agricultural systems. And often farmers are likely already using windbreaks, but we can make them multifunctional, there's something harvestable. And then if you have a stream on your property, I highly recommend doing a riparian buffer. And again, we use that term multifunctional here, but then we also use all kinds of other terms. We have not come up with one unifying word to describe riparian buffers in agroforestry. So sometimes it's called multifunctional buffers. Sometimes it's a multifunctional forested buffer. Sometimes it's an extreme buffer. So you'll hear lots of different words to describe this space, but essentially riparian is a waterway and buffer is the plantings along that waterway, trees and shrubs. And again, we make that multifunctional by having something harvestable from those spaces. So for food, for medicine, for crafts, we can think of all kinds of different products that come from riparian buffers. And so farmers in particular are encouraged to have plantings along waterways, and that's a great way to diversify your income. So if you've got otherwise annual crops that grow right up to the stream, but you're being encouraged to grow trees and shrubs, you're inherently taking some of that income out by doing that. So we can think about diversifying our income by growing other harvestable crops in those spaces. And so that's an option. Riparian buffers are one that farmers can think about, and I highly recommend. And then the last is farmers often have, some parts of their land as woodlots, and maybe those woodlots are not really being used for much. So in those spaces, we can do the fifth practice called forest farming. And that's where we start with the trees, and then we add some kind of harvestable product. So sometimes those products are already growing there and we just don't know them yet. And so those are things like that's again, the native plants, our forest herbs that are naturally growing in our forest areas that are valuable in the botanical markets. So things that we can think about for these spaces, and it's of course depending on the site conditions, but some things that farmers could think about is if you already have sugar maples growing on your land, you can have a sugar bush. You could make maple syrup. In those same spaces, if you have sugar maples, that's also typically a good site to grow ramps or wild leeks. And there are some medicinal plants like blue cohosh and black cohosh, American ginseng, golden seal. There are lots of different plants that can grow in those spaces. And so we can think about planting some of those and harvesting them in some amount of time. Usually they are long-lived species.
Yeah.
And so if you're growing ramps, from no ramp patch at all, it could take 7 or so years before you start getting harvestable crops. And then it's probably going to take a little longer. So it's kind of like for the future.
Right. Okay. So, actually, speaking of ramps and leaks, I saw that you've done some research and work specifically about foraging with like wild onion, wild ramps, wild leeks, all of these
Hmm.
things. And you were looking specifically into how these foraged foods could possibly have an effect on Pennsylvania's food supply chain. So, I guess basically in that research, do you think that foraged foods really could impact the food system, or is that still kind of more of a futuristic goal?
Well, I would say it's already impacting in some ways. So historically, before we had a global food system, people are more reliant on their local farmers and the local foraged foods. And so it was really common for people to have access to things like ramps or wild leeks in Appalachia.
Hmm.
We've since kind of moved away from that because we're more reliant on these global systems. And so I think it's really possible for us to shift back if we start just paying
Right.
attention to our land. I will also say that people are making a living off of foraged foods. There are harvesters who are able to harvest and then sell mostly into urban centers,
Hmm.
Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, DC. And so things like ramps are being sold, sometimes for $20, $25 a pound. And I want to point out that in my research, I was trying to understand, what kinds of practices harvesters were doing in those
Hmm.
spaces, because ramps are slow growing perennial crop plants that can take 5 to 7 years to reach a reproductive harvestable size. And so when you think about how it's collected in its entirety and all of those other factors, or it's a really exciting seasonal food source that's being sold kind of at a premium price, there is some space to be cautious of over harvesting, and we want to be
Right.
mindful of how that's impacting populations. And so my research was to talk to harvesters and everybody else in the food chain about around ramps to find out truly what's going on and how are people feeling about it. And harvesters, by and large, 90% of them practice what they perceive as one sustainable harvesting practice, and most were practicing more than one.
Hmm.
um, and so harvesters, for the most part, are thinking about their impact in these spaces. Um, but I do want to think about the people that these ramps are going to, the consumers, farmers markets, the chefs. Those are the folks that are a little more disconnected and distanced from the source. And that's not
Mm.
unusual, right?
Right.
People are not always connected to where their food is coming from. And we get that just across the board. And so foraged foods are becoming more accessible, but I want to encourage folks to start having conversations with the people that they're accessing these ramps from. If you're going to a farmer's market, talk to those farmers market stands and ask about where were these ramps harvested from, how many were collected, what did the patch look like, because we need to be educating down the line to make sure that when we're accessing foraged foods, that it's a sustainable source, that
Hmm.
we're not, wiping out a patch. And so I guess part of that is when we think about foraged foods, we have to understand more of the biology of the plant or the fungi. So if it's a plant where you're taking the entire thing, like a ramp, most of the time, we want to be a little more cautious about how much we're taking and being really thoughtful to use the whole product.
Hmm.
If we're thinking about things that are just the fruit of the plant, like wild raspberries, black cherries, you name the fruit, it's less of a concern of how
Right.
much we're taking, right? Same with mushrooms. The mushroom itself is the fruiting body, we can think of it as, and the actual organism is within whatever in the ground or in the log that it was harvested from. So taking all the mushrooms is not really that big of a deal because the actual organism is still intact and doing fine. But as far as something where we're taking the whole plant out of the ground, like ramps, like American ginseng, it has a bigger impact on the organism. So the question was, do we see this having an impact on our food system? And I think at this point, we're seeing it become more popular for sure across the board. But is it impacting, say, like food security? maybe not so much, but I didn't ask that question directly to be able to answer it.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's
So
all
that was
very
a,
interesting and like a lot to think
yeah,
about. So I appreciate all of the nuance that you brought to it. So
yeah.
we're going to switch gears a little bit because I know you also serve as the president of the Pennsylvania Native Plant Society. So can you tell me a little bit about what you do at the society and what that work is like?
Yeah, the Pennsylvania Native Plant Society is a statewide nonprofit organization that focuses on educating about native plants and why it's so important to have them in the landscape, and at the same time, educate why we don't want to be landscaping with non-natives or invasive plants. And so a lot of the work looks like going out and doing tabling events across the state. We have a couple chapters. Lancaster has a really active chapter with a few hundred members. I think across the state we have close to 1,000 active members. And we are also doing things like influencing the nursery trade too. So we have a program I'm really proud of called the Green Seal Pledge. My predecessor, Andrea Farrick, kind of led this one. And the Green Seal Pledge is this program that encourages nurseries to sign and pledge that they will sell 50% or more of their nursery stock as native plants.
Oh,
And
that's
in
really cool.
return, yeah, and in return, they get a placard that they can put on in their store somewhere, on the front door, somewhere visible for their consumers to know that they are part of this Green Seal Pledge. They get put on our website. So people who are looking for native nurseries will be able to find their name and location. And hopefully, the way that this is working is to create transparency. Consumers again and again have told us, and I know I've experienced this myself, that they are really excited about native plants. People want native plants. And so they'll go to a nursery in search of native plants, but maybe don't have the knowledge in the background to know which of these plants at this nursery are truly native. And so
Hmm.
it takes a lot of time to then like sit there and try to do a web search to see, is this a native plant? Will this work for what I need? Sometimes there's no cell service in those spaces. And so so it becomes a challenge. There's a barrier of like trying to figure out which plants they should have on their landscape. And so having this icon to say that this is a green seal nursery at least like gets past that first barrier of saying, yes, we definitely have native plants. And likely the nursery workers will be able to talk about which ones are native,
Hmm.
which is great. And so this is helping spread the word of where there are native plants accessible to folks. And we are growing that list every year. And on top of that, the PA Native Plant Society has our annual Central Pennsylvania Plant Festival. And we bring in about a dozen native plant nurseries with all kinds of native plants for sale in one place on one day. It's always the first Saturday in May in State College, Pennsylvania. And so people come from across the state to come and buy native plants, and they have this relief when they get there because everything there is native. So they don't have to even go through that hassle of
Yeah.
trying to figure out.
Don't need to do any Google searching because you know what you're looking at.
Yeah, exactly. So we're really trying to make an effort to help get the word out about native plants, but also conserve them in their natural environments and help do this through things like our Green Seal Pledge. And the last program that I'm really proud of too is our grants program. This year we gave away $6,000 worth of grants across Pennsylvania, and it's to help get native plants on the landscape through native plant gardens and also student projects and helping with locations where maybe people are not accessing native plants based on socioeconomic status. So we're doing a lot to try to get it out there and trying to really grow that grants program.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll see more in the coming years.
Very cool. So, and you touched on this almost a little bit already, but there are so many native plants out there in terms of like
Mm.
flowers, grasses, trees, shrubs, like so many different things. If someone is looking to add more natives, I guess how can landowners kind of narrow down what direction is best to go for their property. And I'm sure it's very individualistic of like, well, what are you looking for? But like, do you have any overall tips, I guess?
Yes. Yeah. I actually did a whole webinar on there. So I'm also a forestry educator for Penn State Extension, and I did a webinar called The Introduction to Native Plant Landscaping, which wasn't about which plants to put on the landscape, because this actually reached national audiences. And I think 1,500 people signed up for this
Oh,
webinar. So it
wow.
was like hugely popular.
Yeah.
So this is like another testament to native plants. And so in that webinar, I really broke down how to talk about native plants to convince or help people with this exact question. So my first piece of advice is to think about, what do you value about your landscape? And so when you sit and reflect on what do you value about the landscape, there's like a suite of things that come to the surface usually. And so one of them is conservation. Maybe you're really passionate about conservation. Maybe you're already somebody who, feeds the birds in the wintertime, and you're connected in that way, but you're looking to expand or really think about that next level of support for your local ecosystem. And so when thinking about that, I really want people to tune into things like that bird watching connection. And I always come back to, native plants are the foundation for your ecosystem. They are providing all kinds of resources, could be personally for you if you're interested in like heart foraging, of course, but they're also providing food and shelter and nesting sites, overwintering sites for all kinds of insects and birds and small mammals and so on. The list goes on and on and on. And so if you think about being a bird watcher, and if you're feeding birds all winter long these really rich, high nutrient diets, in the spring, they are ready to have babies. Like, you're going to have so many nests on the landscape, or you like really set them up for success. But when you think about, what do those baby birds need, the research shows that birds shift their diet. About 90% of birds shift their diets from seeds and dried foods to insects in the spring. And it's because those insects, caterpillars in particular, are really essential for nestling development. And so where are those caterpillars coming from is the next question. And I always bring this fact up, where Dr. Doug Tallamy from the University of Delaware did a study looking and observing birds and native plants and insects, how they're all intertwined. And in one of his studies, they observed one pair of Carolina chickadees over their 14-day nesting period, and observed that single pair to have fed their babies between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars.
Wow, that's crazy. That's a massive amount.
Yes, right. And so if you think about, if you're feeding your birds all winter long and now setting them up for success, they're going to have babies. Imagine how many nests are probably on the landscape. And if each of those nests are needing, even just 6,000 caterpillars, that's a lot of caterpillars that you need to have on the landscape, right? And so to be able to continue to support those birds, you have to have native plants. And that's because these native plants have been here for so long. They have co-evolved with the local insects and birds, all of these other living things, and they recognize each other and rely on each other. And if you were to have non-native plants in the landscape, that relationship doesn't exist. And so you're not going to have the same amount of caterpillars feeding on non-native plants as you do native plants. And so if you're thinking about, what do you value in your landscape, and if it's conservation, if it's birds, pick whatever group in that realm of conservation, you have to have native plants to be able to support the whole ecosystem and many different species. So first thing you need to think about is, what do you value? If it's conservation, you want to be growing lots of different species of native plants, because the more species of native plants, the more different types of insects will be on the landscape, and that builds, right? More insects, more birds, so on. That's the first value system. Beyond that, when you think about what do you value about your landscape, sometimes I talk to folks and they're like, well, I just want a really lovely, peaceful, beautiful place to enjoy, right? And so you want to be thinking about the aesthetics of the landscape. So in that case, the plants that you choose might be, you want to think about different seasonal colors. You want to think about different smells and scents and textures throughout the year. And so the plants that you choose in those landscapes will, be the pretty ones with really lovely flowers. And then it just so happens that they also will be good for conservation. And so there are ways to be thinking about it from that perspective, of the aesthetic perspective. From there, sometimes when I talk to folks and I'm like, what do you value about the landscape? Folks are like, I just don't want to have to mow.
Hey, that's fair.
Yes, right. And so it's like, it's the maintenance part. And so when you talk about native plants, you have to think about native plants are lower maintenance overall. They have evolved to be in this place. So they are mostly drought tolerant. They are better at living in this climate. You don't have to, dig them up and bring them inside in the winter time. Some of our tropical non-native plants that people like to grow just for the summer aren't going to survive here. And then they are also really good, oftentimes, at holding the soil and mitigating erosion and stormwater runoff. And so it's going to save you a lot of time and energy in the long run to have native plants in the landscape than to keep fixing that space in your yard that keeps getting eroded during these extreme weather events. And so maintenance is a great strategy. The value we should have is low maintenance, low mow impacts. And so when you think about what native plants you should have on the landscape, think about those kinds of value systems. What do you want? And then from there are all kinds of resources that exist. One that I really like to help you just think about what options there are in the world for native plants. There's something called PA and Flower. It's a newer search engine, a tool that exists, and you can go and find out what native plants we have in Pennsylvania. And then there's one, Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. That one's out of Texas, but it's a really robust system that you can search by Pennsylvania, by state, and then by all of these other site conditions. You want site conditions. What kind of soil do you have? Is it sandy? Is it clay? And then what kind of water conditions? Is it wet? Is it dry? Somewhere in between? How much sun do you get? So you can click the box with all of those options. And then you can also click the box for all the value things that you like. So do you want bloom time to be a spring flowering plant? Do you want it to smell? I don't know if there's a smell one. There might be a smell one. And then there's usually something about like a wildlife value. And so you can click all of these different factors and it'll bring up a list of plants. Oh, and you can sort by plant type. Is it a tree, a shrub, an herb? Maybe vine too is on there. And then it'll bring up all the list options. And so you can just start pulling out plants and making a written list of everything that you hope to find, a wish list. And then take that wish list and bring it to something like the Pennsylvania Central PA Native Plant Festival and start buying the plants there, or go to the PA Native Plant Society website, find the nurseries and start talking to the people at the nurseries. If they don't have the plants in stock, maybe they have some other suggestions for you.
That's very cool. I might have to play around with that tool and see what I can find.
Yeah, there's a lot that exists. And then there's also like, you can do live stakes. So once you get to know a plant, like dogwoods are really good for this. Elderberry is really good for this. You can grow a few on your land. And once they start to really fill in, you can take cuttings and just plop those in the ground nearby. And you're just expanded for free your landscape with these native plants.
Nice. So you mentioned that, you work with Penn State Extension, and I have talked to a handful of people who work for various extension agencies on the podcast. And I think it's really fun hearing some of the memorable stories that people have when you work in extension. So Do you have any calls or experiences from your time in Extension that really stand out to you?
Oh my gosh, yes, definitely. One that comes to mind that has really been formative for my programming was in my first year, I got a call from a woman who was asking about where she could get willow for basket weaving. She wanted to teach her kids how to weave baskets. And I had never considered riparian buffer plants as some like other than growing them for food as a product or medicine.
Mhm.
I hadn't considered the art side of things. And that conversation led me down the rabbit hole of, oh, what can we weave with? So I called the Central PA Basket Weavers Guild, chatted with someone on their executive board, and that woman was so sweet. She was telling me that in their group, most of the members are retired and they have, like maybe arthritis in their wrists. So actually weaving with willow, though it's beautiful and makes really lovely products, is actually too hard of a product mostly for their group.
Hmm.
But she said that she does know people who weave with willow, and actually instead of making baskets, they're weaving to make caskets.
Oh my gosh. Never would have thought of
Yeah,
that.
same. And at that moment, it was just like a really important spark for me because I didn't mean to stumble into the green burial industry. I work as a forestry educator, but in that moment, I had this idea. There are green burial sites in Pennsylvania. I'm sure some of them have creeks. You could grow willows along those creeks and they could be harvested and woven into caskets and then buried on site. And it'd be the most hyper local burial. And it was just such a funny moment. And so then I've kind of chased this idea of art and agroforestry. So I have this program where I focus on art and how can I incorporate this into my workshops and talks and things because I like to do art
Mhm.
and I would love to learn how to do some of these techniques that bring in agroforestry in unique ways. And so now I do things like black walnut natural dye workshops.
Oh, wow.
And so people come to the workshop because they want to learn how to do natural dye, but these are people who maybe would never come to an agroforestry workshop if that was the title.
Yeah.
And so I'm reaching some like new audiences and kind of opening up and inspiring new types of products and industries. And some of them are things that already exist, like the woody cut floral industry that exists. There are florists all over. And we could be growing things like red stem dogwood in our riparian buffers for conservation, for agroforestry, but also to very easily be cut and sold in the wintertime as a product. When farmers maybe aren't selling things, if you're growing crops, like, wintertime is a slow time, but you could have an additional income if you're just selling for the woody cut floral market.
Mhm.
So I'm trying to think about ways that we can really make things like riparian buffers enticing to farmers
Mhm.
that have products that are easy enough to get into, that have markets that exist, that maybe aren't so much extra labor. I know farmers are tired,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They're doing a lot. So to think about adding another thing on their plate can be maybe not appealing. So if we can make it accessible, if we can make it a quick growing crop that has a reliable product for 20, 30 years, maybe we can make a shift in this where
Mhm.
it's a win-win situation for the environment and for the farmer and for their income.
Yeah. Well, so we're actually going to wrap up. We have one final question. It's something that we ask everyone that comes on the podcast. So, what does being a woman in ag mean to you?
Oh, well, I think it means, I am in ag, but I'm kind of ag adjacent, right? So I'm not getting to get my hands in the dirt every day. So I really find meaning in the connections that I have in ag. So to me, being a woman in ag looks like finding folks who are enthusiastic about their work, who are willing to try new things and think outside the box. And I get to be that connector for them. And I think that's really important work. And I'm really honored to have this space where I get to impact people in Center County, my home county, the state of Pennsylvania, and nationally as a forestry educator and as the president of the Pennsylvania Native Plant Society. So I'm in ag, but I'm a little bit adjacent, and I'm just grateful to be here.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed getting to talk to you, and I stumbled upon you at Ag Progress Days because I went to your native trees talk for the paper, and I was like, oh, I need to talk to her more. She seems cool. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm glad you enjoyed the talk enough to want to chat more.
Awesome.
That was so incredibly helpful to listen to. I mean, it was interesting too, but she really gave us a lot of resources that are available to us to help explore how we can put more native plants into our gardens and properties. You know, I feel like native plants, like the discussion kind of dovetails very easily into, well, I guess it's the same discussion as, you know, non-invasive plants, right? And I feel like that's just something that more and more people need to wrap their brains around, because I think a lot of people, they view their garden kind of myopically in that they're only thinking about, this is how this plant looks in my garden and this is how it affects my garden. They're not always thinking about how that plant actually is part of a larger ecosystem, and therefore that plant is impacting that larger ecosystem. So I love that, you know, we're helping to spread the word on how important it is to go native, and that now there are all these available resources. I love the fact that she's training people in greenhouses and garden centers to be able to help, because I know, like, I have walked into my my garden center and kind of been lost at times. We're just like, okay, like, first of all, I have to figure out like where everything is, like the organization. And, you know, there are certain things that are always very clearly marked. Like my garden center always very clearly marks, like, these are the kind of plants that attract this kind of pollinator. They're great about that, and I love that. But it would be great too if it could be clearly marked, like, this is a native species. It would be great if I could talk to someone and know that that person is going to be able to advise me, like, okay, like I'm looking for, you know, a plant that is going to be, you know, yay tall and yay wide, and I want it to bloom like between this time. Like, what are my options here? And knowing that, you know, we might have those people, those boots on the ground helpers, but also like something on my phone that could help. Yeah, I thought it was great. I loved it.
I agree. I've said it before. I have become a millennial bird person. And like,
yes, I was thinking that when she was
the
talking
thought of
about
like
that.
Planting things specifically to make sure my birds have like food and habitat. I'm like, oh, I love that. Just like, gotta provide for my little friends
the
outside.
babies.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, I know it's okay to kind of stop feeding the birds in the summer because they've got plenty of resources. My morning glories completely took over my bird feeders, and I kind of just let them do it as an experiment to see how crazy they could go. But it is going to be time soon to kind of hack them back and feed the birds again.
Oh, yeah. My bird feeding schedule, which is not scientific in any way. I learned it from my dad. So, you know, if you have beef with it, talk to Dale. But I normally start putting out food around Thanksgiving. It's like, okay, now is your feasting time. And then we do it throughout the winter.
Gotcha.
That's my schedule. But, you know, to have more trees and plants in the yard that provide for them if like my feed runs out or, you know, in those transition months, I got to get some plantings in. So I'm going to be using these resources too.
Yeah. And I've already kind of looked at the one, and now I have added gay feathers to my list of what I would like to plant in my incoming garden.
Your ever-growing plant wish list.
I know. They're so, I've seen them before and they're so pretty. And I love the color of purple that they bloom in. So it's on the list officially. Also, can we talk about something kind of weird that came up? Not weird, but interesting, I guess. The fact that green burials came up, which I had not expected to hear about when you told me that you were going to be interviewing someone who's involved in forestry. But look, to get personal, like, I love the idea of a green burial. I love the
Same,
idea
actually.
of my body just kind of giving back to the soil.
I feel the same way.
And I love the idea of a willow casket. There's something kind of darkly romantic about that, dare I say. I like it better than some other alternatives. Look, I'm not here to like poo-poo any kind of green burial, but another option out there is mushroom caskets.
Mm-hmm.
And we've actually written about them on our website. We've actually covered them on the Industrial Hemp podcast. And here's the thing. I kind of have a weird thing about mushrooms.
That's true. Our office, notoriously, if we are ever getting like pizza for the office, I would say like 90% of people, myself included, are like, oh, get mushrooms. And then there's Candace like, can you get a cheese for me?
Pepperoni.
Or
please.
pepperoni, yes.
I just,
Not
mushrooms kind of, they give me the ick. And so the idea of being buried in basically a giant mushroom, I find unsettling. I mean, I know that the mushrooms come for us all in the end, but I prefer to be wrapped in willow.
Yeah,
So-
no, I think it sounds like peaceful. And I'm also just obsessed with the fact that she got a call from someone about weaving with willow and just like fully went down the rabbit hole.
Yes.
And it led her to green burials. And I'm
Yeah.
just like, again, extension people live fascinating lives.
They do.
And I love talking to them.
Yes. Look out for our new podcast, Tales from Extension.
Tales from Extension. Oh my gosh. I would listen.
All right, I think that wraps it up for us. Thank you all for listening. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing if you haven't already done so. And if you really like this episode, please consider leaving us a review.
If you have any questions or thoughts about this episode, you can email us at farmhouse@lancasterfarming.com.
You can also find us on social media at Lancaster Farming on most platforms.
Thank you again for listening and visiting us at the farmhouse. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Candace.
We'll talk to you later.
Bye.
This episode of The Farmhouse is copyright 2025 by Lancaster Farming Newspaper, part of the Steinman Communications family.
It was written by Stephanie Spiker and Candace Wierzbowski. It was produced by Eric Herlock. It was mixed by Justin Berger. Music by Tin Bird Shadow.